So this video might be a little shorter because there's not as much to say with this stuff. It was a little more just kind of interesting and cool. But one thing I can do is kind of give you guys a more cortical perspective of the things Oliver Sacks was talking about. So when he was talking about Charles Bonnet syndrome, so Charles Bonnet syndrome. This was a syndrome in which people with visual deficits, experienced what I'm going to call pure hallucinations. And the reason I'm calling them pure hallucinations is that they are different than delusions. So whereas a pure hallucination is simply perceiving visual objects that don't exist in reality. That don't exist in reality. A delusion is when this hallucination is emotionally charged, when it addresses you personally. So when people say like, "Oh, I experience every night this demonic spirit that talks to me," that's a delusion. That's not a hallucination. It may go with the hallucination, but it's a delusion by definition. So basically, what we're finding in Charles Bonnet syndrome, and again, this is not a delusion thing. This is purely a hallucination. Is that the visual cortex, right here, is sending out information without any input. So normally, here's your eyeball. It kind of sits in this region of your brain called the orbit, which is right around where the eye is. So there's that. Information comes in here, transduces via your visual system, and projects, goes through the thalamus first, but eventually projects to your visual cortex to lead to the conscious perception of whatever you're seeing. But what happens is when people have, loss of this ability, their visual cortex starts getting, and the best way I can describe this is that it gets bored and it decides it wants to do something. And I'm sure there's a neurological explanation, but as far as I know, we simply don't know why this happens. A lot of times, it could be that because the neuron's not receiving input at a relatively high rate, it's changing some way in which its genes are encoded so that it fires kind of aberrantly. But what happens is that in the absence of any sensory input, so in the absence of any objects that exist in reality, you're getting activity of your visual cortex. And your visual cortex takes two different pathways. So this is what's called your dorsal stream. So this is responsible for detecting movement of visual objects. It kind of goes along with your parietal lobe and attention and spatial awareness and things like that. And it helps you understand how things are moving in your environment. Whereas the visual ventral stream, right? So this is in the brain, this is dorsal, and this is ventral. The ventral stream is responsible for the identity or the recognition of objects. So it likely happens, let's say a patient comes in and they say, "I see a face," right? So here's their hallucination, is out of nowhere, in the absence of reality, they see a face. But not only do they see a face, it has really large and comical looking features, like maybe the nose is really big but the mouth is really small, and maybe one thing that's often reported is that the teeth seem really large, and they seem, people are fairly distressed by this because it looks so strange. But what's likely happening is because there's a region in ventral stream, and it's a little more on the bottom as opposed to on the side. But there's a region called the fusiform face area that contains regions within it responsible for things like eyes and nose and mouth and teeth. So if here's your FFA, fusiform face area, you might have a region that's the face region. You might have a region that's the teeth region, or I guess face is too general. You might have a region that's the lips region. You might have a region that's the teeth region. All of these eventually integrate to form what's called a percept. A percept is a perceived idea or a perceived stimulus, or lack thereof. Perceived, I'm going to call this a perceived visual object. So what happens is, because this visual cortex is kind of firing randomly, what you get is maybe it's sending information, it's sending activation information to, let's say it's to the teeth. It's sending a ton of information to the teeth, but only a little bit of information to the lips. And maybe it's sending a ton of information to the region of the fusiform face area responsible for, let's say, the nose, but not to maybe the left eye. And so what happens is you get this percept, or this perception, that there's this face there, and that it's has these features that are stronger or weaker. And so essentially what this is, and somewhere along the way I lost the outline of my brain here, but essentially what it is it's your visual cortex sending out information and saying, hey, something's here, even though it's not. And it leads to hallucinations. If, for example, this wasn't Charles Bonnet syndrome, if this was a delusion, which would likely not accompany any sensory deficits, you would get not only that, but you would get aberrant activation of, that's the wrong place to draw it, the amygdala, which is deeper, so it's not on the outside surface, but here's the amygdala. So not only are you recognizing this object, but you have information from the amygdala coming in and saying, hey, whatever this is, you should be frightful of it. You should be, you should have an increased heart rate because of it. And what that leads to is people feel their heart rate rising, they feel their blood pressure increasing, and they don't consciously know that that's what's happening, but that leads to them saying, something is wrong, something is making me uneasy, this face must be addressing me, this face must be lying to me, it must be talking to me and telling me that I'm stupid, or telling me that I'm whatever. And that comes from this idea that your amygdala is causing this intense emotional state from which your conscious mind can only try to understand what's going on. I think one of my favorite examples of this type of disorder is called Capgras delusion. It's also known as imposter syndrome. And so there was this group of people, or this population of patients, that claimed that all of their loved ones had been replaced by carbon copies, these imposters that weren't there before. And for a long time, neurologists didn't know what to think of this. They said, oh, well, they must have a problem with their fusiform face area. They must have an inability to recognize these faces, and that's leading them to believe that this is an imposter. But they would say, no, I recognize the face. It's absolutely my aunt or my mom or my sister or my dad. It's just that it's not really them. It's an imposter. And this kind of threw neurologists for a loop for a long time, because they thought, how could a neurological disorder be so specific that it causes you to believe that your close family member is an imposter? And of course, Freud had some ridiculous theories on this. He said, oh, well, obviously what's going on here is that, if you have an inability to feel weird sexual, like Oedipus complex attraction to your mother, then you must think she's an imposter. And as foolish as that is, and, as kind of misguided as that is, it did lead us to this idea that what's going on here is that you look at somebody and you think something's off. It's not necessarily this weird Freudian idea, but it's what these people are doing is they're recognizing these faces of their loved ones, and they're saying something isn't right here. They must be an imposter. That's the only explanation their conscious brain can come up with, because what they see is not producing this same response as it would when they actually saw their loved one. So what happens, and what they think is going on here, is that these people have a disconnect between their fusiform face area, which is responsible for facial recognition, and their limbic system, which is responsible for emotion. So what that means is, when you see somebody whether you know it or not, you can actually measure something called a galvanic skin response, which means that they have an increased activation of the sympathetic branch of their autonomic nervous system. And what that results in is these people, when you see somebody you see your girlfriend or your parents or somebody really well, you feel this sense of understanding that this person is somebody important to you. You could easily pick them out of a crowd because they carry this emotional weight to you. You have this connection between your facial recognition software and your fusiform face area and your limbic system, which is responsible for emotion. But what happens with these people in Capgras delusion is that they don't have this connection. So they see somebody, they recognize their face, so that's all good, but then they don't feel the same emotion. So they think this must be an imposter, right? So here's that fusiform face area is down here. It's just not connected to the amygdala, or it's not connected to the hippocamp, the parts of the brain responsible for producing this change in emotional valence. So, what likely happens is in normal individuals or healthy individuals, what you get is the limbic system then projects to the hypothalamus, which is the autonomic regulator, so it regulates the autonomic nervous system, and you get things like an increase in heart rate, you get an increase in blood pressure, and you get a galvanic skin response. So that's you sweating and then being able to measure the fact that you're sweating. So the reason I find this so interesting is that you can take this insane idea of how could a neurological disorder be this specific and explain it through a simple functional disconnection between facial recognition and emotion. There's also a disorder called Fragoli syndrome, which is pretty much the opposite, where you get, instead of a lack of this activity, you actually get an upregulation of this. So even in response to faces you don't actually recognize, you feel this emotion. So a lot of times people with the Fragoli will go up to somebody. Fragoli delusion. They'll go up to somebody and say, "Hey, how's it going? I haven't seen you in so long." And the people will be like, "Who are you? I've never seen you before in my life." And that's because they see this face and they recognize that, maybe it's somebody they kind of know. So they recognize their face, but they don't know them that well. They feel this in like this weird emotional drive to talk to this person or to bond with them, or, whatever it is that you feel with people you actually know really well. This is to get at all this. The reason I'm telling you all this, the reason I want you guys to keep this in mind is because this is senses are simple. Senses are just something happened in this cell and ions came in and it shot out some neurotransmitter and it led to activation of a neuron. And that's what sense is. But perception is so much more complicated and convoluted, and it has to do with a million different structures. And, it may not seem as important now as it, as some of the other things we test in this class, like equilibrium potential and these really cellular ideas. But going forward, you go through cellular neurobiology to understand how it applies to things like perception. How does it apply to things like cognition, motivation, learning, memory? It may seem you learn in a lot of psych classes, and I know, especially I got really discouraged with the fact that I didn't feel like I was understanding what was going on in the brain. I was just learning a bunch of terms. But going forward with, you'll take classes like circuits and systems neurobiology classes, and you really get a sense of both how these cells work and how they talk to each other and how they produce these crazy beliefs and perceptions and ideas. So that's that. Thanks.